Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to Zechariah chapter 12. Just outside of Madrid is a famous old monastery. Escorial, I think is how you pronounce it. The kings of Spain have been buried there for centuries. The architect who built the church made an arch, and he made it so low that it frightened the king. It frightened him because he thought it would cave in. So fearing that it would collapse, he ordered the architect to add a column to uphold the middle of the arch because he was fearful that it was going to fall. Well, the architect, of course, protested that it was not necessary, but the king insisted, so the column was built. Years later, the king died, and the architect then revealed that the column that he built was a 1/4 inch short of touching the arch, and that the arch had not sagged in the slightest bit, in the slightest amount. I have heard, this is Donald Gray Barnhouse in his book, Let Me Illustrate. He says, I have heard that tour guides still pass a lath. They'll take a little stick or something, and still stick it in there. There's still a 1/4 inch there. It hasn't sagged at all. The column didn't need to be built, Barnhouse writes. And that's proof of the architect's knowledge. Well, that arch can be an illustration of our salvation. It stands because of God, not because of anything that fallen sinners can add to it. But like the Spanish king, people want to add something to help God out. And the idea that salvation is totally from God is an assault on our pride. You recognize that. You recognize that being told you don't have to do anything. Salvation is by grace alone. You felt internally, inside of you, you felt the repercussion from that statement. So even many that profess to believe in Christ as Savior are prone to think that their salvation rests at least partially on something that we must do rather than completely on what God has done. We keep adding our columns. But God's Word clearly shows that God's salvation does not need our human support. God is going to do what God has said He will do. He always will do. Now, it's been a while since we have been in the book of Zechariah, so a little bit of a review. The latter section of Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14, consists of two oracles. Two oracles. You remember the word oracle in a figurative sense means something that is weighty. God's revelation is going to weigh His people down. It's heavy for them to hear this word. That's what an oracle is. And these two oracles form the prophetic plan for Israel's final blessing. In chapters 9 through 11, it is concerned with coming judgment against the enemies of Israel. And in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 9, you have judgment and salvation on the surrounding nations, all those nations around it. And you remember, the surrounding nations are swept up by Alexander the Great. Remember, we talked about that. It's through the sweeping conquest of Alexander the Great. Alexander's sweeping conquests serve as a historic illustration, forewarning of Christ's future conquest when He returns, just as Alexander the Great is going to do from Zechariah's perspective in the future. So Christ will do as well. So will the nations come, and Christ will destroy them. Now, verses 9 and 10 of chapter 9 are a fascinating couple of verses. I'm sure you remember those because they include two advents of the Messiah, but they appear indistinguishable. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Make a loud shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and endowed with salvation, lowly and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a pack animal. Well, we recognize that as the triumphal entry in Matthew 21. When the people shouted, Hosanna, when he came into Jerusalem in that triumphal entry. But verse 10 says, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his reign will be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Well, in between those two verses, so far is almost 2,000 years. Well, 2,500 is here. Verse 9 is the first coming of Christ, the first advent, the Gospels. And verse 10 is the second advent, Revelation 19. The remainder of the chapter, verses 11 through 17, give a fuller detail of the second account, the second advent. Verse 10, that's related to national Israel. And you have the nouns Ephraim in verse 10 and Judah in verse 13. And by those nouns there, it tells us that all of Israel is in view, everything. Even though we do not know where the 10 northern tribes are at, God does, and he will regather them. Chapter 10, you might remember, is the I will chapter. I will 10 times in that chapter. Verses 1 through 5 is the message to Israel to look only to your God in heaven. God will strengthen Judah and from him provide a Messiah to lead Judah in victory. That's verses 4 and 5. In verses 6 through 12, God describes promises of restoration and strength for the remnant of his chosen nation. He will bring them, all of them, back to their promised land. And finally, Zechariah chapter 11 outlines the greatest of all tragedies with amazing detail. The nation Israel rejecting Jesus as their Messiah and the dreadful consequences that follow that rejection. The return of Messiah to the earth is presented in chapter 11 from another viewpoint. It's the opposite view from the ultimate victory in chapter 10 and verse 12. Chapter 10, verse 12, I will make them mighty in Yahweh, and in his name they will walk, declares Yahweh. Well, chapter 11 is from a different viewpoint, the opposite of chapter 10 and verse 12. Chapter 11 really tells us why the events in chapters 9 and 10 did not take place at our Lord's first advent. God called Zechariah to act out, to perform two roles in plain sight of his audience in order to communicate God's message more vividly. Ezekiel was also went to acting school, so to speak, and he did this a few times. So it's not unheard of that God would call them to put together a little drama to show the people what's about to happen. First, a good shepherd that will be rejected. And second, a wicked shepherd that will be destroyed. The Messiah and the Antichrist are those two shepherds. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 14, and then 15 through 17. Rejecting Christ results in great tragedy, personally for every Israelite and nationally as well. And it is the cause of their current condition. Why is it that Israel undergoes and has undergone all of these things throughout the years? And this is the reason. Verses 1 through 14 is the reason. They rejected the good Messiah. That is Jesus Christ. Now someday, verses 15 through 17, someday God is going to raise up a foolish shepherd, that is the Antichrist. He is the opposite of Messiah, the Good Shepherd in every sense. And his job evaluation, you can see there in verse 16, he will not care, he will not seek, he will not heal, he will not sustain. And it may seem, it stuns us to a certain degree to think that all of the blessings and all of the demonstrations and the manifestations of God's power through these years, and yet still they continue to reject, and they continue to be led off the righteous path and to follow the false gods that are around them. Such is the nature of fallen people, which is why God says, do this, because he knows how we are. He knows how sin affects us. Do this, or you will do that. And so he said to Israel, you need to destroy these nations. They offer nothing. They need to be erased from the earth. You need to eliminate them, or they will influence you. They did not obey fully, and they were influenced. John 5 in chapter 5, verse 43, really sums up chapter 11 very well. John writes, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. They rejected the Messiah. Another will come in his name and will deceive not only Israel, but most of the world. That is Zechariah 11, John chapter 5 and verse 43. And that's where we are now in the book of Zechariah. Has God's patience finally reached its end? Is God going to reject the covenant he initiated with Abraham and with Israel, the Palestinian covenant in Deuteronomy chapter 27 through 30? Is he going to reject the covenant with David, his promise with David? You'll note in chapter 11, verse 17, woe there. Woe is pronounced on the foolish shepherd. There have been many foolish shepherds. Just as John says, there are many antichrists now. But it has been 2,500 years since Zechariah wrote this. Has God forgotten? So we come to chapter 12, the second oracle. 12 through the remainder of the book, 12 through 14. This is the Lord's ultimate deliverance of his people. It's Israel's final conflict and great deliverance, says David Barron in his commentary. Here the focus of attention lies more explicitly on Judah and the city of Jerusalem. We'll note the number of times, you'll catch this, the number of times Jerusalem is mentioned in these chapters. Here the focus of attention lies more explicitly with Judah and Jerusalem. It's the future eschatological day, the future day of Yahweh, and on the coming spiritual renewal of the nation. More of that kind of information is coming in 12, 13, and 14. So our focus this week is chapter 12. Our focus next week will be chapter 12, and our focus the following week after that will probably be chapter 12 as well. And the time of the testing of Israel. This is the 70th week of Daniel. This is a time of testing of Israel, specifically the testing culminating in the Battle of Armageddon. What's described here in chapter 12 is the Battle of Armageddon, the final one. So look at your text. Let's read chapter 14. It's only 14 verses, or chapter 12. It's only 14 verses. The oracle of the word of Yahweh concerning Israel. Notice it's not against Israel. It's concerning Israel. Thus declares Yahweh, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples all around. Now, the one in siege against Jerusalem will also be against Judah. But it will be in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who heave it up will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. In that day, declares Yahweh, I will strike every horse with bewilderment and his rider with madness. But I will open my eyes to watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through Yahweh of hosts, their God. In that day I will make the clans of Judah like a fiery laver among pieces of wood, and a fiery torch among sheaves. So they will consume on the right hand and on the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem will again be inhabited in its own place in Jerusalem. Yahweh will also save the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem will not be magnified above Judah. In that day, Yahweh will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as the one who stumbles among them in that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, and like the angel of Yahweh before them. And it will be in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad-Drimnon in the plain of Megiddo. And the land will mourn, each family alone, the family of the house of David alone, and their wives alone, the family of the house of Nathan alone, and their wives alone, the family of the house of Levi alone, and their wives alone, the family of the Shemites alone, and their wives alone, all the families that remain, each family alone, and their wives alone. Wow. Look across the page at chapter 14, verses 2 and 3. Indeed, I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravaged, and half of the city will go forth in exile, but those left of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then Yahweh will go forth and fight against those nations as the day when he fights on the day of battle. There's a description of the Battle of Armageddon, the last effort, at least for a long time, the last effort of Satan to remove God from the throne, to overthrow his plan. This is described in other places as well. In Joel, the book of Joel, Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3, beginning at verse 9. Call out this message among the nations. Set yourselves apart for a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the men of war approach. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves. There bring down, O Yahweh, your mighty ones. Let the nations be roused up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Send in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, tread, for the winepress is full, the vats overflow, for their evil is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of Yahweh is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon grow dark, the stars lose their brightness. And Yahweh roars from Zion and gives forth his voice from Jerusalem. And the heavens and the earth quake. But Yahweh is a refuge for his people and a strong defense to the sons of Israel. You can also read very similar, you can read a different account of the same event in Revelation chapter 16 in verses 16 through 21. There are a number of events that are described here in chapters 12 through 14 of Zechariah. And I want to give you a long quote from an older gentleman years ago. He wrote that the actual events, world bracing in character, which are presented in Zechariah 12 through 14, include a world confederacy against Jerusalem, the victory of God's people. The Lord will empower them, will give them the ability to win. He will fight for them. The conviction of Israel nationally by the Spirit of God, the presentation of Christ as their rejected Messiah, the National Day of Atonement, the cleansing of the hearts of the nation, the purging of the land from idolatry and false prophets. Parenthetically, parentheses, there is a statement of the crucifixion of Messiah in the middle of this. It's in 13:7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and against the man, my associate, declares Yahweh of hosts. Strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered. So parenthetically, you have the crucifixion of the Messiah in there, the time of Jacob's trouble, the partial success of the nations invading Israel and besieging Jerusalem, the appearance of Messiah for his people, their rescue and his coming with his saints, the changed and renovated Holy Land, the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, the punishment of the nations for their futile assault on Israel, the celebration of the kingdom feast, the Feast of Booths, look at chapter 14, and the complete restoration of the people of God to a holy nation. All of that is in these 3 chapters. This gentleman writes, it is impossible to find outside the Scriptures and difficult to discover in the Bible itself a portion of prophecy more vital or revealing. And it's likely the reason why older gentleman O.T. Alice years ago said, if Zechariah is literal, then premillennialism is correct. Well, he knows better now. It is correct. Let's make a little bit of an observation. As we've read through chapter 12, did you notice that the phrase, the little statement, I will make? Did you hear that? Who is the I? The I is the word of Yahweh. So you have in verse 2, I am going to make Jerusalem. You have in verse 3, in that day I will make Jerusalem. Verse 6, in that day I will make the clans of Judah. Clearly, God, being the subject here, is moving, sovereignly causing all of these things to happen. In verse 4, I will strike, God says. And in verse 4, the second line, I will open my eyes. And then he says, while I strike every horse. So he says, I will strike twice in that verse. I will open also in verse 4. Verse 7, Yahweh will also save the tents of Judah. Verse 8, it says, in that day Yahweh will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And then in verse 9, and it will be in that day that I will seek, God again, I will seek. And one more in verse 10, and I will pour on the house of David. So our observation from those first-person pronouns that God is in absolute control. His sovereignty is being displayed in unbelievable, cataclysmic ways. But he is doing it all. In that little phrase, in that day that you saw in there in verse 3 and 4, occurs 14 times in chapters 12 through 14. 14 times in that day. So that's a little bit of an observation. And we'll talk through those as we go through this because we wish to understand this as much as possible. We win. We know We've read the last chapter of the book, so to speak. We win, but we have a divine curiosity that God has put in us because we're created in His likeness and image. Ecclesiastes says man has a desire to know, but he will never find out because he cannot plumb the depths of God's wisdom and His infiniteness. Yet he has a curiosity that's woven into his being to look and to try to discover. Most of the time he lands on creation and then he worships some aspect of creation. But at times he actually gives thanks to the God for the things that he sees in the world and how they hold together and how they come together. So looking here at an outline, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 12 is Israel's physical deliverance. Israel's physical deliverance is depicted in verses 1 through 9. In verses 10 through 14, Israel's spiritual deliverance is depicted. And you can see that in verse 10. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. Before, verses 1 through 9, it has been all physical. Now, it's not as though that God saves His people and then gives them life. It's not a kind of a stage. A lot of these things are happening at the same time. And we'll try to discern some, if it's possible, to discern some events as they happen. But this is Israel's physical deliverance in verses 1 through 9. And verses 1, 2, and 3 tell us that Jerusalem is to be a constant irritant to all the nations around them that presume to know better than Israel. And you see that even today. Israel, in the midst of all of those nations that surround them, Israel is more advanced technologically. Their way of life in Israel, whether you're Arab or Israeli or Jew, is better. The world knows this. Yet Israel continues to be an irritant to all the nations that presume to know better than Israel. All the nations will march against Jerusalem, but all those nations will be destroyed. A day will come when, and I'm saying this different ways. I'm saying the same thing over again. A day will come when every nation will make war against the Jewish people and their capital, Jerusalem. However, the Lord will intervene on behalf of His people, and He will incapacitate all of their enemies. And the enemy here is portrayed as staggering and as herniating themselves, trying to lift this big rock. They're trying to pick up the Atlas stone, and they get a hernia. That's what it's depicted. They're herniating themselves by trying to lift too heavy an object for their capacity. In verses 4 through 9, Jerusalem will be delivered by the final siege, in the final siege, by the coming of the Lord personally. Jerusalem's enemies will be blinded by the Lord. His vision, on the other hand, will be clear. He says in verse 4, I will open my eyes to watch over the house of Judah, but He's going to strike them with blindness. The nations will have to assault the surrounding territory, that is Judah, in order to reach Jerusalem, of course. The Lord will supernaturally energize the defenders of Judah, beginning with the outlying Judean regions, settlements, and He will energize the defenders of Jerusalem as well, enabling all of them to do battle and to defeat their enemies in verses 5 through 9. And this will be the final time that the promise, the fruit of the devastating fruit of the Abrahamic covenant. Remember Genesis 12:3, when it says, the ones who curse you, I will curse. Well, here's the final time in which that devastating fruit of the Abrahamic promise of divine retribution will be harvested right here. The nations will rage against Yahweh and his Messiah under satanic influence. Now, chapters 12 through 14 does not specifically refer to the Antichrist. So why do we say it's satanic influence? Well, in chapter 11, verses 15 through 17, remember who we're talking about? The Antichrist. It's under satanic influence. Other passages would affirm that. So you don't necessarily need an explicit statement in chapters 12, 13, and 14 when you have 11, 15 through 17 and other passages that clearly state that. So it's under satanic influence, but the nations will be swiftly defeated by Messiah. The Messiah will restore his people and reign from Jerusalem, just as the prophets and the Psalms predicted. Psalm 2, Psalm 45, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 24, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 60 through 63, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel's 11, 12. All of these prophecies depict this. In the New Testament, Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, gives an account of that victory and fulfillment. It is so clear in Scripture, so plain, that you really have to work to not see it. You really have to force words to evacuate the plain meaning of the words in order to come up with, we are the spiritual Israel, there is no future for Israel. So you have verse 1, his sovereign word. Verse 2, his seduced enemies. Verse 3, his solid city. And verse 4, verses 4 through 9, his shocking deliverance against an overwhelming odds, which God has done before. It's a fun little study if you wish to do it. Look back to the 67 war between Israel and Egypt and Syria, and those kinds of things. And militarily, there's no answer. Israel should not have won. Those kinds of things. The answer is God is not going to allow them to be erased. He will keep them alive. So let's look this morning at verses 1, 2, and 3. His sovereign word. Verse 1. The oracle of the word of Yahweh concerning Israel. So you have the subject, that's the oracle, and the object concerning Israel. Not against, but concerning Israel. The oracle concerning Israel. And then you have the source of the subject, or you might have the explanation of the subject, where it's coming from. It's the word of Yahweh. Credibility from the start. Here it is, because what's coming is unbelievable, what God says. So we must establish the credibility from the start. So an appeal is made to the creative power of Yahweh so that the people may not stagger at the promise of God through unbelief. As Paul wrote in Romans 4 and verse 21, we must start with who God is and what He has done, His sovereignty, His power, so that we are able to embrace, that we will be fully persuaded that what He has promised, He is able to perform. And so we start out here with His sovereign word. Because what I'm about to tell you, you're going to scratch your head and you're going to say, this cannot be. It just cannot be. What you're about to hear is authenticated truth by the source, the Word of Yahweh, the Creator of the universe. So look at these three verbs that you see there. Thus declares Yahweh, who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the spirit of man within him. Comprehensive. Comprehensive. Those three little participle verbs, stretches out, lays the foundation, forms the spirit of man within him, are very reminiscent of Isaiah's style of writing. You might recognize that, wait a minute, I've heard that before. Indeed, you have. In Isaiah chapter 42, you hear it. Isaiah 42 and verse 5. Listen to what this says. Thus says the God, Yahweh, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and its offspring, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk in it. Very similar. A couple of pages over in chapter 44 and verse 24. Thus says Yahweh, your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. I, Yahweh, am the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself and spreading out the earth all alone. So it's very reminiscent of Isaiah's style, using these things. Clearly, Isaiah and Zechariah know their God. They know their God well. They also know the people to whom they're communicating. And the weightiness, the oracle, the weightiness of what they're about to hear. They need to be fully persuaded that what God has promised, He is able to perform. And so we have the introduction with these words. And the participles tell us that God created, but that God did not step back and simply watch. If that was to be communicated, there would be finite verbs used. There's not. There's participles used. So in a certain sense, God is continually involved in all of these things. That's what is being communicated here. God did not simply wind up the toy, creation, and set it on the table and sit back, fold his arms, and watch and see what was going to happen. Called deism. He didn't do that. He, in a certain sense, is continually involved. Every day he spreads out the heavens. Every day he lays the foundation of the earth, which would collide. It would implode if not governed by his power. See, this God is alive and involved. He is definitely transcendent. He is not bound by anything he created. And yet he is immanent. He's involved very much in his creation. Sustaining it. Moving. That's what this is communicating. So he who worked in creation in the past is the same Lord who continues to work through providence and deliverance in Zechariah's time, in our time, and in the future as well. This is Yahweh, our God. A weighty word is about to come down on the people. He who formed us and shaped us right down to our spiritual being is the one who will continue to shape and guide us by His word and His Spirit up to the end of the age. This is what's communicated. We just kind of breeze by verse 1, and we should not, because it is significant in what it says. You have stretching out the heavens, laying the foundation of the earth, and the peak of his creation forms the spirit of man within him. So did I leave anything out? Is there anything that squeaks, that slips through the cracks, so to speak? No. That is his sovereign word. That's where we must begin, the credibility of Yahweh, our God. Verse 2, his seduced enemies. Verse 2, behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples all around. Now the one in siege against Jerusalem will also be against Judah. I am going to make, again, the sovereign statement by our God. He is the one who is causing all this to happen. The Lord would make Jerusalem like a cup of strong wine to the nations. Now, we mentioned that Jerusalem is the focal point here. Jerusalem is mentioned 11 times in verses 2 through 11. Chapter 12, 2 through 11, Jerusalem is mentioned 11 times. Clearly, Jerusalem is a major focus here. But like a cup of strong wine to the nations, God is going to make them like that. So the nations will greedily consume Israel like a cup of wine. That's the picture being painted here. They're going to see this, as they advertise the sparkling, and you do this with the cup and it flows around and all this nice looking kind of thing, how it appeals to them. The nations will greedily consume Israel like a cup of wine, but instead of being satisfied, it makes them stagger and fall to the ground. There's no joy in this, in what they do. God is going to make Judah and Jerusalem attractive and present her as weak and vulnerable. Easy prey. It's sitting there on the table. You simply need to reach out and embrace this victory. And when they try to consume or defeat Judah and Jerusalem, it will cause them to reel. In other words, God's judgment reduces them to a state of helplessness and misery similar to that of a drunken, staggering, intoxicated man. That's what verse 2 is talking about. Jerusalem had previously drunk the cup of the Lord's wrath, but now it was the nation's turn to drink the cup of the Lord's wrath. Isaiah 51:17. Isaiah 51:17, listen to this text. Providing hope for future Israel. Awaken yourself, arise, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of Yahweh the cup of his wrath. The chalice of reeling you have drained to the dregs. Referring to, you have done this, and the Lord's going to give them hope. That's Isaiah 51:17. Look at verse 22. Thus says your Lord Yahweh, even your God, who contends for his people. Behold, I have taken out of your hand the cup of reeling, the chalice of my wrath. You will never drink it again. It's referring to a time in which Zechariah is describing. There's also the passage in Jeremiah chapter 25 in verses 15 through 17. You could jot that down, look at it later. Refers to the time when Israel drunk the cup of the Lord's wrath. Now it's time for the nations to drink it. And then finally in verse 3, his solid city. His solid city in verse 3. But it will be in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who heave it up will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. In that day, you see that phrase, in that day there. It occurs 14 times, as I think we've noted that already, 14 times in in chapters 12 through 14. It's one of the days, one of the events that will occur in the time known as the day of the Lord. This particular day is the cataclysmic intervention. The intervention by Yahweh as divine warrior. His manifestation will be displayed in all of his glory, or his glory will be manifested, and everyone will be able to see it. And of course, that results in the restoration and the purification of the people of God and the destruction of the nations gathered, verse 2, against Jerusalem and against Judah. Wow. This is quite amazing. So you have in verse 2, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling. Verse 3, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone. Strong statement again of sovereignty. This time, rather than a cup of reeling, it's a heavy stone. It's an immovable rock that the nations could not budge. They looked at this, so to speak. Sure, I can pick this up, but they could not pick it up. They injured themselves. In fact, that's what it says in verse 3. All who heave it up will be severely injured. Now that's a little fascinating little statement there. It's one word. Severely injured. It means to be cut up, to get cut up, grievously cut up. And there's a couple of things going on in the verb form, and then there's an infinitive in there. And you put these things together, and it describes the certain judgment that the nations will bring upon themselves when they gather to overthrow Jerusalem. Paul, you remember what he said to the Judaizers, the Jewish legalists? He called them mutilators of the flesh in chapter 3, verse 2 of Philippians. Then he says, those agitators, I wish they would emasculate, mutilate themselves. Comparative word to what's going on in Zechariah 12. This is what's going to happen. The sovereign God is going to draw the nations, and you see this, all the peoples all around, verse 2. All the peoples, verse 3. And then he describes, and you're going to see more statements in verses 4 through 9 about all the nations and all the peoples. God brings them to Jerusalem. So these two verses, verses 2 and 3, describe Judah and Jerusalem as being something unexpected to the enemy. They are portrayed to be a trap that snares the enemy. They show how God will strengthen the nation for battle so that his enemies, or Israel's enemies, will be defeated. But it is not as though God will stand on the wall, the protective wall, and repel the enemy. Look at chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. It will be in the land, declares Yahweh, that 2 parts in it will be cut off and breathe their last. But a third will be left in it, and I will bring the third part through the fire and refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people. They will say, Yahweh is my God. Chapter 14, verse 2 and 3. I will gather the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured. The house is plundered, the women ravished. Half of the city will go forth in exile. Those left of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then Yahweh will go forth and fight against the nations as the day when he fights on a day of battle. These passages that I just read reveal to us that things will get really bad for Israel before the Lord intervenes. Like I say, it's not as though that the walls are strengthened and he keeps them out of the city. Here, the remnant survives. You've heard of that? The remnant in the Old Testament? The remnant survives. 2 parts will be cut off. The third will be left in it. So things are going to get really bad before the Lord intervenes. It's more like the Messiah comes down from heaven just before the slaughter is complete. The city will be captured, houses plundered, women raped, half the city exiled before the Lord fights against the nations. 2 parts of the land will be cut off and perish, and the third part will be brought through the fire, the text says. Only after this will Israel be delivered. And you ask yourself, why does it take so much? Why does it take this? And you says, they will call on my name. It's going to get so bad, they will call on my name. You read Revelation 6, and it gets bad, but the people who hide in the caves don't call on the name of the Lord. They call for the rocks to fall down on them to kill them because they know the Lord is doing this, and they refuse in their pride to bend the knee to him. But God is going to press hard enough someday that they will call on my name and I will answer them. Look at chapter 12, verse 10. Why would they answer them? Because I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. You know, it occurred to me, have you ever shared the gospel with someone who thinks they're already saved? Not easy. Not an easy. Oh, yeah, I know that. Yeah, I went to church. Oh, yeah, I know Jesus. I know John 3:16. Oh, yeah, I did that. I was baptized. I grew up in church. Yeah, I know about Moses. I'm saved. I walked the aisle when I was whatever. Perhaps the difficulties of trying to save those who think they're already saved, maybe the Israelites think they already know God. They already have a foot. Isn't that what the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes and everybody thought they had a foot in the door? Why? Because they were Abraham's offspring. Because I'm Abraham's offspring, I'm in. But it's going to take this kind of event, cataclysmic event, to force Israel to look up finally and recognize the Messiah who came, whom they rejected, was indeed the Messiah. And they will weep as a mother who loses her firstborn, because they recognize their families were responsible for murdering their own Messiah. This will be the boiling over of anti-Semitism. We know a significant portion of the world are Jew haters, though there is no good reason to be Jew haters. It will come to a head. They will all align, all the nations, regardless of their differences. They have one thing that unites them, a common enemy known as Israel. Once Israel is taken care of, they will fight amongst themselves until they go extinct, probably. But first they must unite against Israel. An army numbering in the tens of millions. Some commentators say hundreds of millions. In the tens of millions will gather against Israel in this plain known as Armageddon, and attempt to overthrow, and the result will be massive destruction of the enemy. Revelation depicts the blood being very deep, that it splashes up on the horse's bridle. That deep in this valley. When God comes to defend his own, however despised the people may be, however despised Israel may be, God will make it to be a cup of trembling to them. They will reel over this. He will make it to be such a burdensome stone that they will not endure. They cannot endure. That's just the first 3 verses. Verses 4 through 9, the actual fight. We will endeavor to go through this and pick up on all the salient details and cross-reference some scriptures, this fight. And then, of course, look at verses 10 through 14 as well. So, beloved, Israel is blessed of the Lord. They are a covenant nation. Not every Jew is saved. That doesn't mean every Israelite or every Jew is saved. But the nation, God has initiated a covenant with it. It will survive. It will reign. The Messiah will reign from Jerusalem, the very Jerusalem, from the Temple Mount where the mosque is now. That's where he's going to reign. It's going to be removed. You and I can't figure out how, but it's going to be removed. We've read the last chapter of the book. We win. So rejoice. Be encouraged. Your God is sovereign. He has stretched out the heavens. He has laid the foundation of the earth. He has formed, and he forms the spirit of man within each of us, and he's continually involved. So rejoice in your God. Keep your eyes fixed on Christ, our hope to come. Know that the promises are yours, and no one can take them away from you. They are yours forever. Lord God, thank you for your goodness and for the clarity of your word. It's powerful. It is mind-boggling, and indeed, as Paul wrote, we need to be convinced that what you have promised you're able to perform.